Chogma, hello everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Indigenous Languages podcast hosted by the University of Arizona's American Indian Language Development Institute, or AILDI for short. For those of you who don't know us, AILDI provides sustained Indigenous language education experience to students, community members, educators, scholars, researchers, and language advocates alike. Our mission is to provide critical training to strengthen efforts to revitalize and promote the use of Indigenous languages across generations. Today, this is a very special episode because we're recording on site at the Symposium of American Indian Languages, which this year is hosted in collaboration between AILDI and the Native American Languages and Linguistics program at the University of Arizona, which is also known as NAMA. And today, I'm joined by a very special guest, Dr. Richard Grounds, who is a Yuchi and Seminole language advocate. Do you want to tell us a bit more about yourself, Richard?
Sanaki asota kere on konfe go chatla go wedine tahe on konfe on ta gohahani shehina gohahani abenchi ake ho onzokwa. I'm greeting you in the Yuchi language and just recognizing that together we can move it forward. That's what our old people were telling us and are still saying to us.
Yeah, that's what we believe here at AILDI as well. So here, yesterday at SAIL, you gave us a very interesting plenary talk that I quite enjoyed. And there was a couple things in that talk that really stood out to me, that really grabbed me. One thing that you said towards the start is you talked about language being the best measure of an indigenous nation's strength or prosperity. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, I think it's helpful to recognize the critical role that our original languages play in our communities at all levels. And if we understand that, if we recognize that, then it means that probably the most critical measure of the health, the cultural health of our indigenous communities, and in many ways the likelihood of the survival of our young people is all connected to the status of our languages. And because, of course, our languages are related to our spiritual life, our ceremonial traditions, our historical knowledge, star knowledge, how to live in sustainable ways in the lands where we come from. So in that sense, it's just such a core part of who we are that, some people talk about our language, our indigenous languages are our medicine. I think that's true. I think that's a good way to think about and talk about the richness of what our languages represent for our communities and why it's so critical. And I'm thinking, we work with young people in the Yuchi community at the Yuchi Immersion School, and we work with them from pre-verbal. We start them as early as we can, and so I'm always thinking about what it means for our young people coming up. How can we help them, and the incredible gift of our language to our young people. And now, it's been really about 100 years since we had a whole cohort of young Yuchi children growing up speaking Yuchi as their first language. And only now, after 25 years of effort, struggles, misdirections, missteps at the Yuchi Language Project, working with our children and youth, some of those past kids that we worked with as small children are now young adults with kids of their own, and now they are committed to raising their children as first language speakers of our Yuchi language. So it's that kind of understanding that I'm coming to the discussion with is the positive impact for our young people. We think it's absolutely critical for as much as we can for them to start out with that understanding that comes with the language, to have that way of speaking the world, of singing the world, of understanding the world.
Yeah, I agree with everything you just said. I find that language really is the best way for anybody, but especially children, to connect to their culture. Now, for me, I grew up connected to my community, but I had absolutely no exposure to my language growing up. And it wasn't until I started learning the language that I really felt, okay, yes, this is really who I am. This is my community. Yeah, and you just can't get that if you don't speak the language.
Yes, I think it's absolutely correct, and I'm glad to hear your confirmation of that. That's what we understand as well in our work with the Yuchi community. There's nothing that connects you to the elders like being able to speak to them in the language. Mm-hmm. There's nothing, shall we say, spiritually, if you're doing your prayers in your language. It just adds a depth that, and it's just, I think it's so vital for our young people. It doesn't, I don't say that it resolves everything, that there aren't still real issues. Issues of substance abuse and other challenges, suicide issues are real in our communities. But if our young people can connect in this deep way with their heritage, it links them, the identity level of being able to speak the language and use it with elders, with in ceremony. It's just such an enriching connection for our young people. We think it's vital for their well-being and ongoing contribution to our communities in positive ways.
Yeah, I mean, that's our future right there.
Yeah.
So in your plenary talk yesterday, you also discussed many aspects of U.S. history. You went over a lot of aspects about how we wound up in this situation because of U.S. colonialism and such. And you used some language that I thought was very powerful. You compared the United States treatment of indigenous languages to carpet bombing, a term that originated from the Vietnam War. Do you want to expand on that a little bit?
Well, just to comment on it, in the big picture, what I was trying to do was, in some ways, in some kind of direct way, try to countermand the colonial messaging. Some people talk about, post-colonial context. I don't think we're in the post-colonial. We're still in very much a colonial
it's
frame,
still happening.
Yeah. As far as I can tell. But the idea of putting on the victims of the colonial assault, it's their fault that it's because they're somehow inferior. Their languages are inferior. Their ways of thinking, their systems of governance, their religious traditions, all those messages are very real. And I know they were very strong when I was coming up. I think they're less, maybe not as aggressive and open nowadays because it's just assumed that the English language is to be dominant. But at any rate, that's part of what I was trying to address in the big picture, was to make it clear that the demise, the downturn in our languages was not simply a natural process, was not simply a higher, superior civilization somehow running over just by happenstance indigenous communities, languages, and societies. It was a very intentional, extremely well-funded, systematic assault. And that's why I'm referring to it as like carpet bombing. The idea of carpet bombing is to destroy everything in sight, level everything, give the victims of the assault no hope whatsoever, that nothing is going to survive. There's no point in resisting. There's no point in pushing back. And that's essentially been, I think, the intentional government planning through particularly the boarding schools, with a lot of support from Christian churches, larger society, educational systems, a tremendous assault that was so well funded. They literally had enough money not only to track down every nation, every indigenous nation, every community within those nations, but every household. They had enough money to go get the kids, from wherever you were. And so that level of funding also serves not only to clarify that this was not just some natural process that occurred in the language loss that we've suffered, but that in fact it was a direct, intentional, extremely well-funded program. And it points to the contrast now. If you look at by today's standards, I guess billions of dollars that went into destroying our languages all over the country with almost 500 boarding schools eventually set up. And now we need that comparable level of funding to restore our languages, to bring back the health and well-being of our young people in a full positive way. If you take that as the measure, if you look at how much money was spent, we're now, I don't know if we can say pennies on the dollar. That's going back to restoring, at least there's a positive intent to support Indigenous languages at the governmental level, but the investment is falling very short, I would say.
Yeah, to return to what you were saying before, I do find that so many people in this country, particularly non-Indigenous people, don't know, or they underestimate the calculated nature of the obliteration of Native American culture and languages, and you could chalk that up to just ignorance, people not knowing. But the sad truth of it is it is intentional that they're not told this, because they're not told this for a reason. It's not taught in schools, and that's just it's evidence that we're not in the post-colonial era yet, because it's still happening in our schools.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, it's quite stunning, the level of it. I try to communicate the extreme aggressive nature of it. Can you imagine what would happen in a first grade school if the kids arrived and the dominant language parents dropped their kids off at school, and then their kids were told, you can't speak English. You will be punished if you utter a word in your home language. Can you imagine the reaction from the parents?
Yeah.
I mean, we would have an absolute, it would be riotous.
It'd be chaos on the streets.
It would be. It absolutely would be. But the point that I'm trying to make with that is that somehow we've just kind of glossed over. Oh yeah, it was a little rough, but no, this was really ugly stuff. The messaging was very clear. Your language is ugly. Your language is dirty. We need to wash it out of your mouth. And that message didn't stop all the kids from speaking, but it almost always stopped them from speaking it to their kids, because they didn't want their kids to be in trouble. And I think of an instance in Tulsa, at the Tulsa City County Library. We had a program. I was on the committee to recognize some word masters in our indigenous communities, Native nations around. Didn't have to be someone from Oklahoma, but one year we were honoring one of the code talkers. And I remember posing the question from the floor during the session in which he was sharing his experience of using his native indigenous language during World War II. And when I asked him I tried to ask him about bringing back our languages and, the importance of keeping our language alive for our young people, or something along that line. I imagined that I was kind of making this softball pitch. Here's a softball that you can hopefully hit out of the park. You're a respected, I want to say almost revered code talker, an amazing individual, gifted in so many ways, and maybe our young people in this, kind of amazing hall where this gathering is going on can hear from you about the importance of our language and keeping it going in the mouths of our young people. And he said, well, I don't know. It's kind of something of the past. Literally was saying, maybe we should just let it go. It was unbelievable to hear this from a code talker who has been celebrated since the news finally was kind of released that this kind of program had been going on. The sadness of that was absolutely overwhelming, but it mostly, I think, was an indication of the level of internalized colonial thinking. That even though his language was used as a powerful instrument in the wartime, in which mostly we have, we kind of elevated that as a sign of the strength of our languages, the sign of the strength of our young men and women in wartime, and all of this. Those are all seemingly positive things, but it was only limited to servicing the interests of the state. If it wasn't servicing the interests of the state, it wasn't very important, and maybe it wasn't needed. And somehow he got that message, and here he was in his senior years replicating that message. It was a sad commentary about how much work we need to do to elevate our languages and to educate ourselves and to push back on all the carpet bombing that's been going on for so long that people are just, they've been sucked into that way of thinking, and there's not much point in fighting back.
Yeah, it's incredibly sad to hear that story of, and I think the way you put it is correct. It's internalized. It's an internalized colonial mindset that's been imposed upon us, and it's sad. We need to fight back against it. But your mention of the code talkers segues nicely into another point I wanted to discuss. In your talk yesterday, you discussed a lesser-known snippet of American history, which is that many government agencies in the early years of the U.S. and even some presidents were interested in learning and studying Native American languages, but this wasn't done out of any altruistic desire to preserve them. It was to help power the steamroller of colonialism. So, can you touch on that a bit?
Well, I think it's very striking, and part of the reason that I was trying to do some research into that background is because I think we have such a quick assumption, an easy acceptance of the idea that academic inquiry is simply value neutral. It's somehow scientific and objective. It's something that's being done because it needs to be understood and presented as a more or less completely, seemingly innocent project. It's just information. It's just data. It's just some scientific process. And in fact, of course, as we know from the great parable that was told by Ruben Alves about the issues of science and technology and its impact on indigenous communities, he talked about the parable of the lamb who was tasked with inviting Professor Wolf to dinner and to come give a talk. And it turns out that, this letter was composed and sent to Professor Wolf about, coming and, what would be the needs of the Professor Wolf in coming to give a talk and all of this. But the lab failed to make one critical inquiry. What are the eating habits of wolves? If you're a lamb, you need to be aware of what the feeding habits are of wolves. The scientific inquiry is pretty good at chewing up little lambs. most of the machinery, the funding, the objectives, the larger vision about the purpose of the research is seldom designed from an Indigenous perspective or with the interest of the Indigenous community in mind. I'm just, the point of that being that, this is such a invasive, intrusive, aggressive process, and we're so often not really aware of that. We're not tracking that. We're not identifying it very clearly, and we allow ourselves to kind of be sucked into the assumptions that it's just somehow a neutral process. So the point of the background on the intertwining of particularly the discipline, what became the discipline of linguistics, with the colonial machinery, with the military apparatus, literally with the physical assault on indigenous nations. All of this was part of the collecting of the intellectual data of our ancestors, of our living community members at the time, and that kind of background. So if you look at the great expeditions of the mid and later 19th century, they did a lot of work on, they produced a whole Klamath dictionary. But this was all part of the colonial steamroller that was coming to crush these people. It was not something that was being generated in order to help the communities to preserve their language, their traditions, and like I guess in some ways similar to the boarding school process. The boarding schools were essentially designed to stop the languages first and foremost, to stop the singing, to stop the dancing, to put it into the stories. That was the point. And that was why they had to be boarding schools, to take the kids away from their homes, their families, their communities, their elders, where otherwise they would know their clan stories. They would be speaking their language. That was the point of it being a boarding school, was to effectively intervene, completely cut them off from that constant input of the cultural traditions through their languages.
Yeah, so to latch on to something you were saying there about the colonial nature of linguistic research, that in the past especially, but yeah, unfortunately that's still an issue today, that a lot of linguistics research is rooted in these colonial methods. So I believe you would agree that we need to decolonize our research methods, and we need to decolonize our funding sources for this kind of work, right?
Well, yeah, and I don't know that I have addressed it real clearly about this kind of historical pattern of the kind of ugly origins of the majority of the language collections over the last 200 years, starting particularly with the work of Thomas Jefferson, in which there was a intentional project when indigenous leaders from native nations were compelled to go to Washington to try to make some kind of agreement, to talk with leaders, to say, hey, we're living here. We have our families, our way of life. What's going on? And this effort to negotiate with leaders in Washington, then these became opportunities to collect the language data. And this was a very intentional project, particularly under Thomas Jefferson, who was himself the principal architect of the so-called Louisiana Purchase, the theft of about a third of the continental United States. And it was just Europeans putting things on paper and writing them down.
Yeah, well, it's one group of Europeans buying something from another group that neither of them owned in the first place.
Indeed. And so it would take another 100 years of genocidal assault we can start tracking the massacres on the Marias, at Sand Creek, at Wounded Knee, on the Washita, et cetera, et cetera. It was one thing to claim it on paper, but then the actual ugly process of the assault meant that this kind of colonial notion of the superiority of European peoples, their presumed intellectual superiority, their mental capacity, this could be tracked through phrenology, through collecting crania and skulls. And I mentioned that in my talk, that these were kind of parallel processes. The collection of indigenous skulls was specifically pursued by government directive through the U.S. Surgeon General's, Army Surgeon General's office, who sent out these orders, and they literally had direct military engagements with indigenous defenders, freedom defenders, who were, if they had the misfortune of being gunned down by the U.S. military, then they were subject to having their heads taken, being decapitated, and that's where that big collection at the Smithsonian came from. Much of it, the bulk of it. But the point, what I was struck with is the brutality and the ugliness of it. But it's mired in this notion of European superiority, and that was also reflected in the language studies. The indigenous languages were presumed to be somehow inferior, somehow barbaric or savage. These were terms that indicated your level in the scale of human progress or lack of progress towards civilization. And this ugly background is kind of dropped out of view, but what it means, the fallout is, or the ongoing consequences are, that's where these archives came from, the American Philosophical Society, these institutions that house all this language materials that was collected, particularly in the 19th century, but ongoing. The purpose of those collections was what I call intellectual colonialism, for academics to carry out the discipline of dissecting, reviewing, researching this material. Our own indigenous community members could hardly get in the door. Fortunately, this is starting to change, but the entire structure and the makeup and the accessibility to these places is really, it's all designed for the intellectual colonial project, which corresponds with the academy. And that's what we're trying to overcome. It's not the end of the story, but we need to work together to rethink how we're going to do this.
Thank you. I think that was all very well said. Well, Richard, are there any last thoughts you want to leave us with today?
Nafagale non we onkaju tahe onkonfete. I think we don't want to forget that together we can move it forward. We are only at the midpoint of the life of our indigenous communities and languages. We are now raising my grandkids only speaking in our original language. It can be done. It is being done. But we have to work together to do it. It takes, I think, all the stakeholders working together, pulling together, learning from one another. We have to be smart about it, and it's no longer kind of a natural process. We have to be very intentional about what are the effective ways to carry forward our languages, our songs, our story traditions. How do we make the richness of our heritage alive and real for our children coming up behind us, so that our languages and ways of life continue to be normalized. This is who we are. This is how we are. This is how we see the world. This is how we live in the world. These are our responsibilities in our original instructions, and how we will move ourselves forward in sustainable ways on this planet. But that knowledge is essentially carried through our languages, and that's why I think this gathering here is such a critical piece. It's an important juncture for kind of academic scholarly ways of thinking to try to blend with community-based work. But at the end of the day, the only thing that really matters is the life of the language in our communities. That's where it matters. It doesn't matter if our languages are somehow written in a dictionary or on recordings in the shelf at the university library. What matters is that our language lives in the hearts and minds and tongues and bodies of our young children coming up behind us.
All right, thank you, Richard, so much for those thoughts, and thank you for coming here to SAIL. I think you contributed greatly to this year's conference. So yes, Yakuke, thank you. I'd also like to say thank you to everybody who listened to today's episode. If this is something that you enjoyed, we'd really appreciate it if you could share this with your friends, your family, your social media followers, or whoever you want. It would help us greatly. If you'd like to keep up to date with new episodes, remember to follow us on Twitter and Instagram at COEALDI. Also, feel free to check out our Facebook page. There should be links to all of these in the description. Lastly, if you would like to donate to AILDI, through which this podcast is funded, you can do so on our website. So again, thank you all for listening, and Chapisalacho, see you again soon.